have these picnics. Usually, you bring a blanket along to spread out on the ground. And when I was a kid, what we brought along was a big old patchwork quilt. Been in our family for a long time. Kept us warm in winter, and in the summertime, we'd sit on it for picnics, and maybe if we fell asleep in the car coming home, we'd get wrapped up in it. So I always loved that patchwork quilt, and I asked my mom once where we got that patchwork quilt from. She said Grandma made it. And then she started telling me the different stories of all the patches in that patchwork quilt. There was a piece of pants on that quilt that came from my uncle. One day my uncle was out riding a horse. He fell off the horse and he ripped his pants. Ripped them up so bad that Grandma couldn't fix them good enough to wear anymore. But my Grandma didn't waste anything. She took that old pair of pants and she cut them up. And she sewed up the good parts into a patchwork quilt. And there was a piece of apron on that patchwork quilt that came from my Aunt Betty. My Aunt Betty's a real good cook, and she always brought a big Nesco roaster full of baked beans to those potluck dinners. Plug it in and blow out all the fuses. But she always wore an apron when she was cooking so that she wouldn't mess up her clothes. Back then we didn't have a whole lot of clothes, so you had to take care of them. And over the years that apron got all full of food stains, and she got tired of it. She was going to throw it away. My Grandma didn't waste anything. She took that old apron and she cut it up. And she sewed it up into a patchwork quilt. And that taught me two things about my grandmother. One is that my grandmother was into recycling. Before we had that fancy word recycling, we used to call it not wasting stuff. Might be something people need to learn how to do again. The other thing is when I was snuggled down under my grandma's patchwork quilt, I was being kept warm by my whole family. Just kind of a nice thought. So my friend Larry Penn from Milwaukee wrote a song about his grandma's patchwork quilt, and I'm going to play it on this instrument we call a concertina. On my grandma's patchwork quilt, squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. Now if you'd like to sing along with that, it's real easy. On my grandma's patchwork quilt, squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. On my grandma's patchwork quilt, squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. It was a patchwork quilt so fine, just an art of good design. A piece of sister's dress next to Grandpa's vest, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. On my grandma's patchwork quilt, squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. I got a pillow for my head, and it wants to be my friend. Nothing keeps me warm in a big snowstorm like my grandma's patchwork quilt. On my grandma's patchwork quilt, squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. The reason I sing songs like this is they got a pretty good message to them, and here comes that message. Around the world, people wait for a day when there's no hate. We treat each one like my grandma done on her crazy patchwork quilt. On my grandma's patchwork quilt, squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. Now my grandma's gone to rest, and her quilt is all that's left. Her love, I swear, it's in every square of love my grandma's patchwork quilt. On my grandma's patchwork quilt. Squares of corduroy and silk, red and green and blue, yellow too, on my grandma's patchwork quilt. And her love, I swear, it's in every